No. Just tell me straight out. Jose does or doesn't want to break out. What? The horses. What about the horses? There are 25,000 of them. And they pull all the weapons and all the supplies. Yeah, I see. So, wait, so Jose doesn't just want to walk out of the city with nothing? Huh. Yeah, okay. December 18th, 1942. The Soviets recently turned the tables on the Axis, encircling an entire German army at Stalingrad. Well, you can imagine what comes next. A major offensive to try and relieve that army, and it begins this week, Operation Winter Storm. I'm Indy Neidell. This is World War II. Last week, the Soviets were attacking the Axis all over the Eastern Front, up at Velikiluki, in Operation Mars, against Rzhev, against the Stalingrad Pocket, and along the River Chir. The Japanese had major supply problems at Guadalcanal, and the Allies were stopped for the time being in Tunisia, though they are in a hurry to take Tunis before the winter rains begin. They are advancing from the east in North Africa this week, though. On the 12th, the British 8th Army captures Mersa-Brega. That day, Axis commander Erwin Rommel begins to abandon his El Agheila position for a retreat to Tripoli. The Mareth line in southern Tunisia will be his final stand. The 14th El Agheila is attacked by the 7th Armored Division, while the New Zealanders try a flanking maneuver. Because of their success in the enemy rear 2 days later, the El Agheila forces split into small groups to get away. The 17th, Rommel leaves a rearguard to cover his forces while they consolidate at Buerat. But on the other end of the front in Tunisia, there is a lull this week as both sides recuperate from the recent fighting. Of course, there is plenty of shelling, and by now the German guns have ruined Medjez. But here's the thing. The Allies really want to reach Tunis before the rains come and render the land unsuitable for any kind of fighting. Okay, there are some 180,000 American troops in North Africa by this point, but just 12,000 of them are in Tunisia. There are also 20,000 British and maybe 30,000 French, but they are really poorly equipped. The Germans and the Italians have 56,000 troops there by now, so it's roughly equal-ish, and 160 tanks. But as we've seen, they also have aerial superiority and good terrain for defense. From the Mediterranean coast, 20 miles west of Bizerta, the line extended just east of Medjez El Bab and then down the entire length of Tunisia. German soldiers held the northern sector, with the 10th Panel Division shielding Tunis and the Italian Superga divisions held the south. Nowhere was the enclave deeper than 40 miles. The Axis have a new commander. Walter Nering's replacement arrived last week on the 8th, and he is Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, who left a corps command in the USSR on Adolf Hitler's orders to come to Tunisia to take over the newly formed 5th Panzer Army. Now on the 13th, he announces that 5th Panzer Army will go over to the defensive. Guess who is going to build the defense fortifications? The local Jews. Yeah, Tunisia has a small but ancient Jewish community, and 3,600 have been drafted, and they have food and they have equipment. This week, though, the Council of the Jewish Community is told that since they are allies, they have to pay 20 million francs to cover the Allied bombing damage to Tunis. This they do, putting up property as collateral for bank loans. Actually, in this month's War Against Humanity series, you can learn a lot more about what's going on with the Tunisian Jews, so be sure and check that out. Meanwhile, the Allied attacks are scheduled to resume the 24th. There will be a full moon, and they'll have supplies for a week of hard fighting. Kenneth Anderson, commanding the British First Army, plans to throw literally everything he has at Tunis, as many of his men are already living hand to mouth. Before any attack at Tunis, however, he'll have to take Longstop, a German hilltop outpost some 10 kilometers from Medjez El Bab, with a commanding view of the river, the valley, the road, and the rail to Tunis. Well, I say a hill. The Allies think it's a hill. It's actually two hills. A ravine separates two crests, so taking one is meaningless, and British recon cannot see the second. Perhaps they will before their preliminary attacks go off next week. Anderson's men may be living hand to mouth, but that is way better than some of the Japanese. I've mentioned several times over the past few weeks that since the Japanese have been prevented from bringing in rations to the men of the 17th Army on Guadalcanal, many of them are by now at or near starvation. The entire army was composed of pale wisps of men, with ulcerous skin draped over filthy, sopping clothes. Vast numbers were racked with fevers for which there was no medicine. In his diary, 2nd Lieutenant Yasuo Ko'o recorded an unfailing formula with which he calculated the life expectancy of his fellows. Those who can stand up, 30 days. Those who can sit up, 3 weeks. Those who cannot sit up, 1 week. Those who urinate lying down, 3 days. Those who have stopped speaking, 2 days. Those who have stopped blinking, tomorrow. It was in this severely debilitated condition that the 17th Army faced a new attack. But they do have at least a strategic advantage. Mount Austin gives the Japanese a great observation point from where they can see what's going on with the Americans. Henderson Field, ship arrivals, well, everything. So a limited attack to take that, thinks newly arrived Americal Division Commander Alexander Patch, would deny the Japanese that intelligence and give him a jumping-off point for a flanking attack for the offensive he plans for January. Mount Austin isn't really a mountain, though, or even a single peak. It's a bunch of ridges together in the jungle at the end of some foothills about 3 kilometers from the shore. On the 16th, Patch orders it taken. The 17th sees American recon and the 18th light skirmishing, but the week ends without major contact. But there's plenty of major contact this week in the Soviet Union. Now, there's been fighting around Velikiluki for the past 2 weeks, but it turns out that all of that was just a prelude. At 8 a.m. December 13th, 3rd Shock Army Commander Kuzma Galitsky launches an all-out offensive against the Germans at Velikiluki. Attacks by the 257th Soviet Rifles push into the northwest outskirts of the city. The Luftwaffe cannot help the defenders. They've been grounded by the weather. On the 14th, the Soviets keep up the pressure and capture their first major German positions in the city, though the Germans still hold the citadel and some areas west of the river Lovat. But on the 15th, Soviet tanks reach the Lovat and capture the railway bridge south of the citadel. Just after noon that day, the Soviets send men under a flag of truce to offer surrender terms. German commander Eduard von Sass rejects them. So, on the 16th, Galitsky hits the Germans with bombers, rockets, and heavy artillery. The PE-2 bombers drop 13 tons of bombs on the city. The Luftwaffe can also fly this day, though, and they drop in 10 tons of ammunition and shoot down 12 Soviet planes. Hitler sends von Sass a personal message. I express my appreciation for you and your soldiers for their bravery. I am convinced that you will hold like iron, as General Scherer did in Cologne, until you are relieved. It seems German High Command is nervous about the situation there. Sass does manage to create a new defensive perimeter, and it stops the Soviets after 4 days of advancing. They make no serious attacks the 17th, except for artillery bombardment. But on the 18th, Galitsky throws his forces at the enemy from the south, establishing a presence between German strongpoints. After 6 days of intense urban combat, the frontline soldiers on both sides in Velikiluki were exhausted. The city itself was now a shattered, burning wreck, with rubble and craters making any kind of tactical movement difficult. The Red Army was learning just how difficult it was to capture a fortified city, while German senior commanders were learning how difficult it was to conduct battles via radio. There's more tough fighting for the Soviets to the southeast, as Operation Mars continues against the Germans in the Rzhev-Sichovka region. It's tough going for those Soviet troops who were surrounded last week. They're trying to break out, while the Soviet 41st Army tries to break in and relieve them. And it's only 4 or 5 kilometers that separate them, but that doesn't happen. And by the 14th, those encircled are running out of ammo. They are ordered by Georgy Zhukov to destroy their equipment and make a break for it the 13th to friendly lines, which they pretty much do. In the bigger picture, the 20th, 31st, and 29th Armies renew the offensive along the whole line already the 11th, and so do the 5th and 6th Tank Corps. But Operation Mars, so massive in scope, is already dying out by now, it seems. They are nowhere close to eliminating the German 9th Army, or taking Rzhev, or Sichovka, or Bely. The Kalinin front has gone 50 kilometers or so. The Western Front far less, only like 6 kilometers deep and maybe 10 or 11 wide. And as Svetlana Gerasimova points out, this was the highest daily casualty rate of all the operations of the second and third periods of the war. Every 24 hours, the troops of the Kalinin and Western Fronts lost on average 8,295 men. Well, Mars might be finishing, but it still isn't finished. But if things aren't going well there for the Soviets, they sure are further south. Markey and Popov's new 5th Shock Army begins its offensive as planned the 13th, surprising the enemy, and they and Prokofy Romanenko's 5th Tank Army hit hard at Rychovsky and the confluence of the Chir and the Don rivers. Rychovsky finally falls that day, and the Ostrovsky bridgehead is also now like 18 kilometers wide and several kilometers deep. Popov orders his forces that night to take Verkhnechirski, which they do by the 15th, and the 5th Tank takes Surovikino. The recent Axis defeats all over this region, the demolition of the Romanian Third Army and the encirclement of the German Sixth Army by Operation Uranus, the Red Army outer ring fronts on the Chir and the Aksai, leave German High Command and Erich von Manstein's Army Group Don with only one option to prevent their entire front from collapsing: launch a sudden and immediate thrust to reach Sixth Army from the southwest. So, on the 12th, Operation Wintergevitre, Winter Storm, begins. Manstein begins his offensive from Kotelnikovo. Hermann Hoth is in tactical charge of 13 divisions for this offensive, attacking the Soviet 51st Army. Well, the German 6th and 23rd Panzer Divisions from 52nd Panzer Corps, with what's left of the Romanian 6th and 7th Corps, hit 51st Army pretty hard and reached the southern approaches to the Mishkova River the morning of the 14th. Late that day, Stavka changes plans and tells 2nd Guards Army to not make its offensive against the Stalingrad pocket, which is supposed to begin the 15th, but instead head out to help 51st Army. This will take a few days to set up, though. As for the Stalingrad pocket itself, the first 3 days of the week sees a real lull in the fighting in anticipation of 2nd Guards Army's now cancelled offensive. Thing is, until last week, 2nd Guards Army was supposed to be the spearhead of Operation Saturn, which would blast out and head for Rostov, trying to cut off all of German Army Group A and much of B. But events have caused Stavka to cut Saturn down to Little Saturn. And on the 16th, the Soviets begin Operation Little Saturn, without 2nd Guards Army, hitting the Italian 8th Army on the River Don. There are also huge attacks on Army Group Holit on the Chir. So Manstein's west flank is suddenly in real trouble. The Little Saturn attacks are by the Southwestern Front's 1st and 3rd Guards Armies, together with the 6th Army from the Voronezh Front. While this operation develops, 5th Tank and 5th Shock Army's operations on the Chir and the Don become a Tormozen offensive on Little Saturn's eastern flank. And Little Saturn becomes a rout of the Axis the 17th. Thing is, Hoth is still advancing, and his forward tanks have reached the Aksai River. The 6th Panzer Division is 56 kilometers from Stalingrad, but on the flanks, the Italian 8th Army is collapsing, and in Stalingrad, 6th Army Commander Friedrich Paulus seems not to be making any effort to break out. So today on the 18th, Manstein sends his intelligence officer into the Stalingrad pocket to coordinate a breakout with Paulus. Neither Paulus nor his chief of staff, Major General Arthur Schmidt, believed 6th Army was sufficiently mobile or robust to assist in such a link-up. Instead, Schmidt insisted that Army Group Don provide more supplies for the ongoing airlift and asserted that any breakout attempt by 6th Army would end in disaster. Paulus and Schmidt are not just being stubborn, though. I mean, Hitler has repeatedly refused to tolerate any withdrawal from Stalingrad. And since 6th Army is currently expending about twice as much ammunition as they receive by air, that's going to make any breakout tricky. They're also short of gasoline if they ever plan to drive out, and though they only have 25,000 horses after evacuating the other 70,000 for the winter, those eat tons of supply. But without them to pull artillery and supply wagons, any breakout would have to be on foot and without any heavy weapons. And how much good would that be? And with that existential question, the week comes to an end. A week of planning in Tunisia, advance in Libya, hunger on Guadalcanal, and advances by both the Soviets and the Axis in the Stalingrad region. But it's a good question. I mean, if Hoth can't make it to the city, and Paulus tries to break out to reach him, there are logistics to consider. Sending out 6th Army on foot with no heavy weapons or supply is suicide. But feeding 25,000 horses so they can help with that drains all of the army's supply. And Hitler's been telling him not to go. Don't know if you remember, but it was Paulus who ran the war games the winter of 1940 to see if Barbarossa was feasible. And Paulus who determined that no, it wasn't. And now it is Paulus, surrounded in Stalingrad with 25,000 horses to deal with. I bet in the future, Alanis Morissette will write a song about him. Obviously, you're just dying right now to see that special episode we did about the Paulus War Games and what Jose Paulus, that's his nickname, what Jose Paulus concluded. And you can do that right here. Our Time Ghost Army member of the week is Peter Sferonius. The Time Ghost Army is responsible for all of our logistics and supplies. And though we do not, as it happens, have 25,000 horses to feed, we do have to keep these episodes, specials, and all of our sub-series coming out to you 52 weeks of the year, which is not easy. So join the army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. Please consider upping your pledge if you are already a member, because we have all kinds of special stuff happening in 1943. Do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.